Warning. The following episode of The News is Broken contains discussion of transphobia and sexual abuse, including child sexual abuse, that some viewers may find distressing. Hello and welcome to this special extended edition of The News is Broken. Now in this episode I'm going to be talking in depth and trying to solve one of the biggest political discussions of our time, which, yes, as a comedian, is a risky move. Like, sure, you could end up like John Oliver doing a funny, well-researched piece of topical comedy with journalistic integrity. On the flip side of that, though, you could also be Paddy McGuinness.
We're all adults, Glasgow, right? We all like a double entendre, right? Now, I can live with, it's a little bit sticky, come and have a nibble. I can live with that. But the kids all round me flock. This lad makes Glitter look like a fucking choir boy. I don't know how we're going to solve knife crime and gun crime, right, but I was brought up with a little bit of discipline. And I think if we had a bit more discipline and a lot more respect for each other, we might just sort it out. Thanks for listening tonight, Glasgow. Good night!
And yes, before anyone asks in the comments, that clip is unedited. Today I'm going to try and strike somewhere in the middle of those two options as we take an in-depth look into the political reaction to last week's Supreme Court ruling on the definition of woman in the Equality Act. Now, I'm not going to go into depth on the ruling itself. It's already the subject of a lot of discussion in the past week that doesn't really need going over again. Feels like a waste of time, you know. You've got things to do and places to be, and well, I'm here. But whilst I'm not going to talk about the ruling, I do want to quickly acknowledge how it came about and why, what has caused this issue to take up so much discourse in the past week. And this is all the result of a case being taken to the Supreme Court by 4 Women Scotland, an anti-trans hate group named after the number of members they have. And yes, to be clear, I am referring to them as an anti-trans hate group, not whitewashing their reputation like most of the media by calling them a women's rights group. Indeed, just a brief look at their website will show you that the only campaigning they do surrounds the Gender Recognition Act and excluding trans people from public life. They absolutely do not campaign on anything that will materially improve the lives of women in this country. And I'm sure at this point that they're really desperate to call me out for mansplaining, but unfortunately for them, I have never had my chromosomes checked, so under their own definitions, they cannot accuse me of mansplaining until they are certain of my biological sex. And I'm sorry, that's not my decision, but the ruling of the Supreme Court. The case was to try and clarify the meanings of the word man and woman in the Equality Act. I would argue that the ruling that they have provided has very much failed in doing that, given that their clarification is now leading to so many changes in legislation and guidance due to how it has been understood that the Gender Recognition Act and the Equality Act work in tandem for almost 2 decades. Indeed, at this point, they've confused the public conversation so much, I think I might need a Supreme Court ruling to clarify the definition of clarify. There are 2 points that are worth mentioning with all of the discussion surrounding this, though. The first is that the Supreme Court stated in their judgment that whilst the ruling allows single-sex spaces to exclude trans people, they are not legally required to do so. And now this is where it gets weird, because the second point is that they could always fucking do that. There was always an allowance built into the Equality Act to allow single-sex spaces to exclude trans people if it were a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. Indeed, one person who should already be more than familiar with this exemption in the Equality Act is 4 Women Scotland crowdfunder and part-time author J.K. Rowling, who in 2022 opened Bearer's Place, a support service for victims of sexual violence that does not hire or provide services to trans women. The reason she could legally run that service was because of this already existing exemption. Indeed, given the fact that the exemption was already explicitly stated in the Equality Act, you should probably be questioning at this point whether what the Supreme Court did was clarify the intention of the Equality Act as it was written, or change it to suit the whims of anti-trans campaigners. For now, though, let's move on to the government response, because, as I said, the Supreme Court says that this ruling does not legally require single-sex spaces to ban trans people. The Labour Party seems to have other ideas.
There's now a need to ensure that this ruling is clear across a range of settings, from healthcare and prisons to sport and single-sex support groups.
So, given that the Labour Party seem intent on pushing trans exclusionary policy to be UK law, today I'm going to look at the spaces this could impact, the real-world effects it could have, and where we go from here. And who knows, maybe in a few minutes I'll also remember that this is supposed to be a comedy show and throw in a joke somewhere. So let's begin with what is apparently now everyone's sanctuary, their safe space. Public toilet. There's been a lot of frankly unhinged discussion about toilets in recent years, and personally I never realised just how people seem to be so focused on the genitals of the strangers surrounding them when using the loo. And honestly, I'm now even more self-conscious when using public toilets than I ever was before. So let's get straight to the point. Trans people are not a risk to you when using the toilet. It's as simple as that. Excluding trans women from women's toilets does nothing to make cis women safer. No male predator is going through the effort of pretending to be trans to gain access to women's toilets, and suggesting so is essentially creating a fantasy world in which predators have more respect for a picture of a silhouette of a woman than they have for actual living, breathing women. And if you genuinely believe that that sign alone is enough to stop a predator, then the solution to the problem of male violence in female spaces is not banning trans women from public toilets. It's simply putting up a sign that says, no sex crimes. Heck, you don't just have to use that in toilets. You can make outside spaces safer again with signs that say, no ball games, no sex crimes. You can make swimming pools safer with signs that say, no running, no diving, no bombing, no sex crimes. And if you're sitting there right now thinking that this suggestion is clearly ridiculous, fucking course it is. But it's no more ridiculous than the suggestion that a cis male predator would feel the need to pretend to be trans in order to access a women's toilet. Now, there's been a lot of talk in recent days about what the biological sex ruling will mean for trans people, with a lot of talk focusing on what the reaction would be if passing trans men enter women's toilets or passing trans women enter men's toilets, and I understand the temptation to make that argument. I will say, though, that I do think it's a dangerous strategy to pursue as an argument against the ruling, because, to be blunt, non-passing trans people also deserve rights, respect, dignity, and safety. So I completely get why people want to use the "this man is now going to be in the women's toilets" as a gotcha argument, but I think we need to be more careful about how that point is expressed and ensure it's not going to be used to the detriment of the community. I do also think it's worth stressing that the Supreme Court ruling did preempt that kind of argument in the most insane way possible. Because whilst the ruling states about access to spaces being based on biological sex, it does include a loophole that trans men could be excluded from women's spaces because the gender reassignment process has given them a masculine appearance. And I'll be honest, I can't read that sentence without my brain automatically responding, yeah, no shit, Your Honour. But the fact is, that sentence demonstrates just how unworkable this entire ruling is, because it legally creates a world where trans women are men and trans men are women apart from when they aren't. You can't claim that what you've offered is clarity when you can't even state what single-sex spaces a trans man should be in, if indeed they're even allowed in any under this ruling, which the wording would very much suggest that they aren't. And if you're arguing that biological sex is the most important factor for consideration, you can't say that trans women are men but trans men are also men, as that is in no way logically consistent. And the fact is that, frankly, there is no way of monitoring who is entering public toilets in a way that isn't deeply invasive to both trans and cis people anyway. Like, what are we wanting, toilet police? Sorry, I just need to check you've got a vagina before I let you piss. We just need to do a quick chromosome test before you have a shit. Don't mind me just checking what size gametes you have. The reality is that what will actually happen is that people will just judge based on looks, and this will not just harm trans people, but also gender non-conforming and mass-presenting cis women. But look, at the start of this, I said I'd try and find where we go from here. The solution to the problem presented that will make everyone feel safer. To be honest, I don't know why I promised that, but I have committed now. One solution is to make all public toilets individual, lockable cubicles. That is undeniably the safest solution for everyone, whether you're a man, a woman, non-binary, cis, trans, whatever. Because the truth is, no matter how much we seem to be pretending it is for some fucking reason, no public toilet is a safe space. You know nothing about anyone that you're sharing a space with, no idea what their intentions are or what they're capable of. Sex-segregated spaces don't inherently mean safe, and this entire anti-trans campaign is built upon the flimsy foundation that it does. Acknowledging that makes their entire worldview fall apart. For example, we can take a look at the case of Nicola Murray. Nicola is a gender-critical activist who founded Brodie's Trust, a charity that supported women who had suffered pregnancy loss and domestic violence. Through her charity, she was a vocal critic of the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre, claiming that the centre, being trans-inclusive and having a trans woman as CEO, put women at risk of harm. Indeed, she made headlines claiming she was being discriminated against for her gender-critical views when Police Scotland visited her in relation to public comments she had made about the ERCC. In March this year, Nicola was found guilty of 3 charges of assault, 2 sexual assaults, 2 cases of indecent communication, 1 indecent assault, and 2 offences of behaving in an abusive or threatening manner. These cases were spread over a period of 20 years, and all of the victims were children. She was a cis woman who used a position of power she held to abuse children whilst using her public platform to claim that trans people are a danger to society. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on some of the worst crimes that she committed because this video is not the place for that. But I did want to mention that one of the claims against her involves her using transphobic slurs aimed at a child because it demonstrates the role that her bigotry played in her abuse. And when discussing trans people accessing single-sex spaces, there are always anti-trans activists who will share stories of the small minority of trans people committing crimes in those spaces to justify a widespread ban. But, as I've just demonstrated, there are people who will commit abuse regardless of their sex or their gender identity, and you cannot hold those cases against an entire group. Indeed, if you've never heard the name Nicola Murray before, but you have heard the name Isla Bryson, you should probably question why the majority right-wing media in the UK has given so much focus to one of these cases and not the other, and question what they could be using the isolated incidents involving trans people for to manufacture consent. And look, I've just focused on toilets so far, but everything I've said applies to many other spaces as well, such as changing rooms and hospital wards. Trans people do not pose an inherent safety risk to anyone in any setting, and to claim that they do is rooted in bigotry. In the UK, we're supposed to have a legal system of innocent until proven guilty, but right now, there seems to be a presumption of guilt on trans people that them just going about living their daily lives poses some kind of safety risk to others, and it is a frankly unacceptable level of discrimination to be targeted at a minority group. And to be clear, this action against trans people is not going to make women any safer. Firstly, putting trans women in men's spaces is going to increase their risk of being victims of male violence. Secondly, the Office of National Statistics reports that between 2017 and 2020, 85% of women that were victims of sexual assault by rape or penetration were victimised by someone they knew. 45% of all women that were victims of sexual assault by rape or penetration were victimised by a partner or ex-partner. Only 15% were victimised by a stranger. So the real risk to women isn't who is in a public toilet or a changing room or a hospital ward, but who is in their house. You'll notice there's no push from gender criticals for sex-segregated houses. I mean, yeah, Graham Linehan now lives in one, but that very much wasn't his choice. But the reason there's no push for sex-segregated houses is because they know it wouldn't do anything to help, because the solution to this isn't to spend every waking moment obsessing over trans people, as J.K. Rowling seems to do on Twitter these days, but to actually fight to stop cis male violence. Essentially, what I'm saying to J.K., to put it in terms she'll understand, is she needs to sort her priorities out. And look, there's a lot of other discussions happening right now regarding trans inclusion where the situations are much more nuanced discussion, but not in the way that anti-trans campaigners would like you to think. For example, crisis centres and refuges. At first glance, it seems reasonable to suggest a level of sex segregation until you give it literally a single second of thought, and you realise that the only people going to those spaces, cis or trans, are going because they need to, because they've been victims of sexual assault or domestic violence. Stopping a trans person from accessing those spaces for ideological reasons does nothing to make women safer, but it does a lot to risk more harm to those trans people in need. Indeed, earlier I mentioned the controversy the anti-trans campaigners tried to manufacture around the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre, and this did lead to a review into the ERCC commissioned by Rape Crisis Scotland. The review came to the conclusion that the way the ERCC implemented its trans-inclusive policies did not put survivors first, and they came to that conclusion despite the fact that 93% of survivors said they felt hopeful about their future after their time with the ERCC. And indeed, that report only found 2 instances of survivors actively avoiding the ERCC due to their trans-inclusive policies. Rape Crisis Scotland actually stopped referring people to the ERCC following that review, despite it demonstrating that their trans-inclusive policies had no negative impact on the safety of survivors. Another quite heavily discussed topic is inclusion in sports. Indeed, the topic of sports is very much used as a pipeline to radicalise people into anti-trans bigotry. I'm not going to go too in-depth into sports, but I will quickly acknowledge it, since both Equalities Minister Bridget Phillipson and EHRC Chair Kishwa Faulkner mentioned sports this week in relation to the Supreme Court ruling. To be blunt, the Supreme Court ruling does not have jurisdiction over sports. Every sporting governing body for every individual sport at every single level has its own trans-inclusion policies, and these policies should be based on science and treated on a case-by-case basis related to that sport, not dictated by the ideology of any Supreme Court justice or politician. And sporting bodies should not be pressured to make their policies less inclusive to trans people purely to feed into ideological bigotry. I will say, though, a lot of this discussion focuses on a myth that men will transition purely to beat women in professional sports. It is worth acknowledging that trans people have been able to participate in the Olympics since 2004, and in that time, only 2 trans people have won medals. Quinn, a non-binary footballer, and Alana Smith, a non-binary skateboarder, and both won their medals at the 2020 Olympics, participating under the sex they were assigned at birth. There has been no evidence of trans women taking over professional sports, no matter how much Riley Gaines wants to publicly shit herself about coming joint 5th to a trans swimmer. Finally, prisons have been heavily discussed following this ruling, and again, I believe a lot of the heat surrounding this is purely due to mass misinformation about how the prison system works for trans people. To be clear, trans people cannot just self-identify into a prison. Trans women are only allowed into a women's prison following stringent risk assessments, and it is considered on a case-by-case basis to make sure that the prisoner will not pose any harm to any of their fellow prisoners. There is a heck of a lot of nuance in the discussion surrounding prisons, and despite what anti-trans campaigners seem to want people to believe in online debates, there is a safe middle ground between all trans women go to women's prisons and all trans women go to men's prisons, and it is important that it is taken on a case-by-case basis, taking into account the safety of the trans person, who would potentially be at increased risk of sexual violence in a men's prison, and the safety of their fellow prisoners. And there we are, I've now demonstrated better diplomacy than our current government. So where do we go from here? I suppose the ultimate answer is that we need to start holding cis men more accountable for their actions towards women, instead of scapegoating minority groups. We need to work towards a society where women are safe from the actions of cis men. We need to work towards a society where those men who commit violence against women actually face consequences. We need to dial down the anti-trans rhetoric coming from our media, our legal system, our politicians, and ensure safety and dignity for all trans people. I suppose, essentially, what I'm saying is,
I was brought up with a little bit of discipline. And I think if we had a bit more discipline and a lot more respect for each other, we might just sort it out.
oh fuck, I'm a Paddy, not a John.